The warm summer breeze rustled through the cornfields as the sun began to set over the Henderson family farm. Located in the remote outskirts of Missouri, the modest homestead had been in the family for 3 generations. The young couple who now owned it had worked tirelessly to maintain its legacy, making improvements while preserving its rustic charm. Mrs. Henderson, 7 months pregnant with their first child, had grown up on her father's ranch in Texas. Unlike many women of her time, she had learned to handle firearms from an early age, becoming an expert marksman under her father's watchful guidance. Her husband often joked that her shooting skills were what had first caught his attention, even before her kind heart and gentle smile. That particular evening, Mr. Henderson had driven into town for supplies, leaving his wife to tend to the evening chores. She moved carefully through their daily routine, her growing belly a constant reminder of the precious life she carried. The chickens needed feeding, and the 2 dairy cows were waiting for their evening milking. As she worked, she kept her father's old revolver close, a habit born from years of living in isolated areas. The setting sun cast long shadows across the farmyard when she first noticed something amiss. The farm dogs, usually vocal at any disturbance, had fallen unusually quiet. The horses in the barn seemed restless, their nervous whinnies carrying through the still evening air. Years of ranch life had taught her to trust these subtle warnings from their animals. Moving quietly, she made her way back to the farmhouse, her senses alert to every sound and movement around her. Through the kitchen window, she caught glimpses of movement near the barn, shadows that shouldn't be there, moving with purpose rather than the random patterns of wildlife. Her heart began to race, but her hands remained steady as she positioned herself strategically within the house. The intruders, a group of local troublemakers who had been terrorizing farms in the region, had chosen their target carefully, or so they thought. They had watched the farmer leave for town and assumed his pregnant wife would be an easy target. Their plan was simple: raid the farm's storage, take what they could carry, and perhaps help themselves to the money they believed every farmer kept hidden away. What they didn't know was that Mrs. Henderson had already moved the valuable items to safer locations after hearing rumors of farm robberies in the area. More importantly, they had no idea that the seemingly vulnerable woman they planned to intimidate was anything but helpless. As the first intruder approached the back door, Mrs. Henderson took a deep breath, remembering her father's lessons about remaining calm under pressure. She had already positioned herself where she could see both entrances to the house, making sure to stay in the shadows. The weight of her revolver provided a familiar comfort as she prepared to defend her home and unborn child. The floorboard's subtle creak near the back door sent a chill down Mrs. Henderson's spine. She could hear whispered voices now, at least 3 different men discussing their plan. Their confidence was evident in their careless movements, clearly believing the farmhouse to be an easy target. The pregnant woman placed one hand protectively over her belly while the other gripped her father's revolver with unwavering steadiness. Through the lace curtains, the moonlight revealed more details about the intruders. They wore bandanas covering their faces, carrying burlap sacks and crude tools. One man, taller than the others, seemed to be their leader, gesturing silently toward different parts of the house. Mrs. Henderson recognized him from town. He'd been watching her husband's movements at the general store last week, though she dismissed it as casual curiosity at the time. The farm's isolation, once a source of peace for the Hendersons, now seemed to embolden the intruders. The nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away, and the local sheriff's office was even further. Mrs. Henderson knew she would need to handle this situation alone, at least until her husband returned from town. She silently thanked her father for insisting she learn to shoot and handle difficult situations with a clear head. Inside the house, she had already implemented her defensive strategy. Years of helping her father protect their ranch had taught her valuable lessons about home security. She'd quietly moved furniture to create obstacles in the hallways, making it harder for anyone to move quickly through the house. The kitchen knives were strategically placed out of reach, and she'd removed the oil lamps from their usual spots, leaving the intruders to navigate in near darkness. The pregnant woman's mind raced through her options as she heard them testing the back door's lock. She could fire warning shots, but that might escalate the situation unnecessarily. She could try to reason with them, but revealing her position might put her at a disadvantage. As she weighed her choices, she remembered her father's words, "The element of surprise is often your strongest weapon." Mrs. Henderson's training kicked in as she heard them beginning to force the door. She moved silently to her chosen position, one that gave her clear views of both the back door and the main hallway. The familiar weight of the revolver in her hand provided comfort as she steadied her breathing, just as she'd practiced countless times at her father's ranch. The baby kicked, as if sensing its mother's tension, and she whispered a quiet prayer for protection. The intruders had clearly done this before, working with practiced efficiency to force the lock. What they didn't know was that Mrs. Henderson had deliberately left that door's lock slightly damaged after the last time she'd heard rumors of farm robberies. It was part of her careful plan. She wanted to control which entrance they used, and they were playing right into her hand. As the lock finally gave way with a soft click, Mrs. Henderson took one final deep breath. The moment the first shadow crossed the threshold, she would need to act decisively. Her father had always taught her that hesitation in crucial moments could be dangerous. She watched as the door slowly began to open, the hinges creaking in the tense silence of the farmhouse. The moonlight streaming through the window caught the metal of their tools, creating eerie reflections on the kitchen walls. Mrs. Henderson could hear their confident footsteps, their whispered instructions to each other, and the subtle sounds of their weapons against their clothing. They moved with the assurance of men who believed they had nothing to fear from a lone pregnant woman in an isolated farmhouse. Little did they know, they had walked into a situation that would soon challenge everything they thought they knew about vulnerable targets. Mrs. Henderson's fingers tightened slightly on her revolver as she prepared to defend her home, her unborn child, and everything she and her husband had worked so hard to build. The kitchen floorboards groaned under the weight of heavy boots as the first intruder made his way inside. Mrs. Henderson remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing just as she'd done during countless hunting trips with her father. The darkness worked to her advantage, concealing her position while the moonlight through the window silhouetted the incoming figures. "Check the bedroom first," the tall leader whispered to his companions. "That's where most folks keep their valuables." His voice carried a hint of local accent, confirming Mrs. Henderson's suspicion that these men were from the surrounding area. They knew too much about the layout of local farmhouses to be random drifters. As they moved deeper into the house, Mrs. Henderson's earlier preparation proved invaluable. The first man stumbled over a chair she'd carefully positioned, causing a startled curse and momentary confusion among the group. Their overconfidence was making them careless. None had thought to bring a lamp or torch, assuming the dim moonlight would be sufficient. The baby chose that moment to kick again, and Mrs. Henderson pressed her hand firmly against her belly to stay quiet. Her mind drifted briefly to her husband, probably still in town gathering supplies. She hoped he wouldn't return early and walk into this situation unprepared. The thought strengthened her resolve. She needed to handle this situation before it could escalate further. Through the darkness, she could make out three distinct shapes. The leader remained near the kitchen while the others began moving toward the bedroom. Mrs. Henderson knew she had to act before they separated too far. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, "Control the situation before it controls you." Drawing upon years of experience, she spoke with a calm, authoritative voice that cut through the darkness. "I suggest you gentlemen reconsider your choices." The effect was immediate. The intruders froze, startled by the unexpected sound. "I have a clear shot at each of you, and unlike you, I know every inch of this house." The leader attempted to maintain control. "Now, ma'am, don't do anything foolish. We're just here for valuables, not to cause trouble." His voice carried a false note of reassurance that made Mrs. Henderson's skin crawl. She knew their reputation. These men had left several local farms in shambles. "I'm giving you one chance to leave," she replied steadily. To emphasize her point, she pulled back the hammer of her revolver, letting the distinctive click echo through the quiet house. "The next sound you hear won't be so friendly." The men exchanged uncertain glances, visible even in the dim light. Their plan had hinged on finding a helpless woman, not someone who clearly knew how to handle herself. The leader took a hesitant step forward, testing her resolve. In response, Mrs. Henderson fired a single shot into the floorboard near his feet, demonstrating both her marksmanship and her seriousness. The sound of the gunshot shattered the night's silence. The horses in the barn whinnied in alarm, and the farm dogs began barking frantically. The leader stumbled backward, finally realizing the gravity of their miscalculation. His companions, who had been creeping toward the bedroom, quickly retreated to the kitchen. "The next one won't be a warning," Mrs. Henderson stated firmly, her voice unwavering. "I learned to shoot before I learned to read, and this baby I'm carrying hasn't affected my aim one bit." She kept her position secure, maintaining her advantage in the darkness while they stood exposed in the moonlight from the kitchen window. The tension in the room was palpable as the intruders faced their first real resistance. They had grown accustomed to easy targets, elderly farmers, young families, people too frightened to fight back. But here they faced someone who not only had the means to defend herself but the skill and determination to do so effectively. Mrs. Henderson could see the uncertainty in their body language, the way they shifted nervously and glanced at each other. Her shot had done more than demonstrate her ability, it had shattered their confidence and their assumptions about their chosen target. Now they had to decide whether to escalate the situation or accept defeat at the hands of a pregnant woman. The farmhouse fell into tense silence after the echoes of the warning shot faded away. Outside, the dogs continued their frantic barking, creating an alarming chorus that would surely alert any nearby travelers. The sound gave Mrs. Henderson an idea. She knew that old Mr. Cooper, despite living 2 miles away, often rode past their farm on his evening checks of his cattle. There was a chance he might hear the commotion and investigate. "Your reputation precedes you," Mrs. Henderson spoke clearly, keeping her voice steady. 3 farms robbed in the past month. The miller's place was completely ransacked. The Thompsons' youngest boy still has nightmares. She deliberately mentioned details that only locals would know, watching their reactions carefully. "How long before someone recognizes you in town?" The leader shifted uncomfortably, his confidence clearly shaken. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. His companions exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of her calm authority. Mrs. Henderson felt her baby move again and took strength from it. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I also know that Sheriff Williams has been gathering descriptions from all the farms you've hit. How many more witnesses do you think he needs?" The youngest of the group, who couldn't have been more than 20, took a step back toward the door. The fear in his movement was obvious. This wasn't the easy target they'd expected, and now they were facing consequences they hadn't considered. His retreat created a ripple effect, causing the others to glance nervously at their leader. In the distance, the distinct sound of hoofbeats began to emerge. Mrs. Henderson silently thanked Providence, someone was indeed approaching the farm. The intruders heard it too, their heads turning toward the sound. The leader's hand twitched toward his weapon, but Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I wouldn't," she warned, her finger steady on the trigger. "That's likely Mr. Cooper on his evening ride. He's already heard my warning shot, and he always carries his shotgun. The sheriff's office is his next stop on his usual route." She was embellishing slightly, she couldn't be certain it was Mr. Cooper, but the approaching rider had created the perfect opportunity. The youngest intruder broke first. "We need to go," he whispered urgently to the others. "This ain't worth it." His eyes darted between the window and the door, calculating his escape route. The fear of discovery and prosecution was becoming more real with each passing second. The hoofbeats grew louder, now accompanied by the jingle of tack and the sound of a horse's snort. Mrs. Henderson could tell the rider was moving at a deliberate pace, likely drawn by the sound of her warning shot and the continuing chorus of barking dogs. "Time's running out for a quiet exit," she advised, her voice carrying both warning and opportunity. "Leave now, and I'll give you a head start before I start describing you to the sheriff. Stay, and you'll have a lot more explaining to do." She kept her aim steady as she spoke, her years of practice evident in her unwavering hold. The second man began backing toward the door, following the youngest's lead. Only the leader remained somewhat defiant, though his bravado was clearly crumbling. The approaching rider was close enough now that they could hear the crunch of hooves on the gravel road leading to the farm. "This isn't over," the leader growled, but his threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. Mrs. Henderson met his gaze unflinchingly through the darkness. "It was over the moment you chose the wrong farm," she replied calmly. "Now go, before you make an even bigger mistake." The younger two men were already slipping out the back door, their footsteps hurried but trying to stay quiet. The leader, realizing his authority and plan had completely unraveled, finally backed away from the confrontation. His retreat was slower, attempting to maintain some dignity, but the fear of discovery hastened his steps as the rider drew closer to the farm. The sound of hurried footsteps faded into the night as the intruders disappeared into the darkness behind the barn. Mrs. Henderson maintained her vigilant position, knowing that moments of retreat could sometimes be deceptive. Her father had taught her that the aftermath of a confrontation could be just as crucial as the encounter itself. The approaching rider turned out to be exactly who she'd hoped, old Mr. Cooper, his weathered face appearing in the moonlight as he drew closer to the house. His shotgun was indeed balanced across his saddle, just as she'd predicted to the intruders. The dogs' barking had transformed from alarm to welcoming as they recognized the familiar visitor. "Mrs. Henderson?" Mr. Cooper called out cautiously from his horse. "Heard what sounded like trouble. Everything all right up here?" His voice carried both concern and readiness, characteristics that had made him a respected figure in their farming community for over 4 decades. "I'm fine, Mr. Cooper," she responded, finally allowing herself to lower the revolver slightly. "Though I'd appreciate it if you could stay a moment until my husband returns." She kept her voice steady, not wanting to worry the elderly farmer unnecessarily, but grateful for his timely appearance. Mr. Cooper dismounted with the practiced ease of a lifelong horseman, his eyes scanning the property as he approached the house. "Saw 3 riders heading toward the creek bed at quite a pace," he commented, his tone making it clear he suspected they were more than just casual travelers. Mrs. Henderson drew a deep breath, her hand instinctively moving to her belly as the baby gave another strong kick. The adrenaline of the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving her feeling both exhausted and accomplished. She'd protected her home, her unborn child, and potentially helped put an end to the string of local farm robberies. "They chose the wrong farm," she said simply, managing a small smile as Mr. Cooper entered the kitchen. She began lighting the oil lamps she'd earlier removed, bringing warm light back to the room. The familiar glow revealed the evidence of the intruder's brief presence, muddy boot prints on her clean floor, the chair they'd stumbled over, and the mark from her warning shot. Mr. Cooper let out a low whistle as he surveyed the scene. "Reckon they did at that. Your father taught you well." He'd known her family for years, having done business with her father back in Texas. "Mind if I fix us some coffee while we wait for your husband? Something tells me the sheriff will want to hear this story firsthand." As Mr. Cooper busied himself with the coffee pot, Mrs. Henderson found herself reflecting on the evening's events. The skills her father had insisted she learn, which had sometimes seemed excessive for a young girl, had proven their worth. She remembered the countless hours spent practicing at the range, the lessons about staying calm under pressure, and the importance of reading people's intentions. The familiar sound of wagon wheels on the gravel road announced her husband's return from town. Mr. Cooper moved to the porch to signal him with one of the oil lamps, ensuring he wouldn't be alarmed by the unexpected visitor. Mrs. Henderson could hear the concern in her husband's voice as he quickened his pace toward the house. "Everything all right?" he called out, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. When he saw his wife standing calmly in the kitchen, one hand resting on her belly and her father's revolver still within reach on the table, his expression shifted from worry to understanding. He'd married her knowing full well that she was more than capable of handling herself, but seeing the evidence of it still filled him with a mixture of pride and relief. Over steaming cups of coffee, Mrs. Henderson recounted the evening's events to her husband and Mr. Cooper. The kitchen, now warm with lamplight and the comfort of familiar company, felt worlds away from the tense darkness of the confrontation. Her husband's hand remained protectively near hers as she described the intruder's entry and her strategic response. "You kept the damaged lock on purpose," her husband realized, shaking his head with newfound appreciation for his wife's foresight. "I'd been meaning to fix that for weeks." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he remembered how she'd always found some reason to delay the repair. Mr. Cooper nodded approvingly as she explained her preparations, the moved furniture, the strategic positioning, the careful use of darkness to her advantage. "Reminds me of your father's teachings about home defense," he commented. "Always said the best protection comes from careful planning." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Williams, his horse's hooves thundering up the drive. Mr. Cooper had sent one of his ranch hands to fetch him after first arriving at the farm. The sheriff's usual easygoing demeanor was replaced with focused attention as he entered the kitchen, notebook already in hand. "Mrs. Henderson," he greeted, removing his hat. "Heard you had some unwelcome visitors this evening." His eyes tracked the muddy boot prints across her clean floor, his experienced gaze taking in every detail. "Mind walking me through what happened?" As she recounted the events once more, the sheriff's pencil moved rapidly across his notebook. His expression grew increasingly interested when she described the leader's voice and mannerisms. "And you say he knew the layout of local farmhouses?" he asked, looking up sharply. "Yes," she confirmed, remembering the confident way they'd moved through the darkness. "They knew exactly where to look for valuables. Mentioned checking the bedroom first, like they'd done it before." The sheriff exchanged meaningful looks with Mr. Cooper. "That matches what we've heard from other farms. These men have been systematic, targeting properties when they think they'll find minimal resistance." He paused, adding another note to his book. "Though it seems they've finally made a serious miscalculation." Mrs. Henderson's husband squeezed her hand gently. "They certainly did," he agreed, pride evident in his voice. "Could have saved themselves a lot of trouble by choosing another farm." The sheriff closed his notebook, his expression thoughtful. "Your description matches what we've gathered from other victims. The tall leader, the local accent, the younger accomplice." He tucked the notebook into his vest pocket. "This could be the break we needed. They'll be nervous now, knowing someone can identify them. Might make them sloppy." Outside, the night had grown quieter. The dogs had settled, and the horses in the barn had returned to their peaceful rhythms. But Mrs. Henderson knew the peace felt different now. It was the peace of victory rather than vulnerability. She hadn't just protected her home, she'd helped make all the local farms safer. "I'll have deputies patrolling the creek bed area tonight," the sheriff continued, rising from his chair. "Those men will be looking for quick escape routes. And I'll send word to neighboring counties to watch for 3 men matching their description." He placed his hat back on his head, adjusting it with practiced ease. "Mrs. Henderson, your courage may have just helped us solve a string of robberies that's been plaguing this county for months." Word of Mrs. Henderson's confrontation with the farm robbers spread quickly through the community in the following days. The general store became a hub of conversation, with farmers and their families gathering to discuss the event and share their own experiences with suspicious activities around their properties. The morning after the incident, Mrs. Thompson arrived at the Henderson farm with a freshly baked apple pie and tears in her eyes. "My boy slept through the night for the first time in weeks," she shared, referring to her young son who had been traumatized by their own encounter with the robbers. "Knowing those men got scared off, it's given him peace of mind." Mrs. Henderson's husband had taken to performing extra security checks around the property, not out of fear but from a renewed appreciation for his wife's vigilance. He installed better locks on all the doors and added extra lighting around the barn, implementing many of the security measures his wife had learned from her father. The local newspaper ran a story about the incident, careful to withhold specific details that might compromise the ongoing investigation. The editor focused instead on the importance of community vigilance and preparation. Several local farmers' wives approached Mrs. Henderson after Sunday service, asking for advice about home defense and protection. "It's not just about knowing how to shoot," she explained to a group of women during a quilting circle that had transformed into an impromptu security discussion. "It's about being aware, being prepared, and most importantly, staying calm under pressure." She shared her father's wisdom about home security, from the strategic placement of furniture to the importance of maintaining regular routines to spot unusual activities. Sheriff Williams made good on his promise to increase patrols in the area. His deputies reported that several suspicious camps had been discovered and disbanded near the creek bed, suggesting that the robbers had indeed been using the area as a base of operations. Local farmers began organizing regular patrol groups of their own, coordinating with the sheriff's office to ensure better coverage of the remote areas. The incident had transformed Mrs. Henderson in the eyes of the community. While some had previously viewed her self-reliance with skepticism, they now sought her counsel. Her husband beamed with pride when other farmers complimented him on his wife's courage, though he always responded the same way: "I knew exactly who I was marrying, a woman as capable as she is kind." One afternoon, as Mrs. Henderson worked in her garden, old Mrs. Wilson from the neighboring farm brought over her granddaughter. The young girl, no more than 12, had been fascinated by the story of the brave pregnant woman who had outsmarted the robbers. Mrs. Wilson explained that her granddaughter had been having trouble finding confidence in herself. "Would you tell me how you learned to be so brave?" the young girl asked shyly, helping Mrs. Henderson collect ripe tomatoes from the vine. Mrs. Henderson thought carefully before responding. "Bravery isn't about not being scared," she explained, remembering her own father's words. "It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you are scared. And it's about being prepared, knowing what you're capable of and trusting in those capabilities." 2 months after the attempted robbery, the Henderson farm was transformed by joyful news: the arrival of their healthy baby girl. The same community that had rallied around Mrs. Henderson's courage now celebrated new life, with visitors bringing gifts, meals, and warm wishes. The birth seemed to mark a new chapter not just for the Henderson family, but for the entire farming community. Sheriff Williams chose this time to bring significant news. He arrived one autumn afternoon, while Mrs. Henderson was sitting on the porch with her newborn, enjoying the crisp air and golden sunlight. His horse's approach stirred up fallen leaves, creating a dance of red and gold in the yard. "Thought you'd want to know," he began, settling into a chair after accepting a cup of coffee. "We caught them, all 3 of the men who tried to rob your farm that night." He explained how the gang had attempted another robbery in a neighboring county, but their newfound nervousness had made them sloppy, just as he'd predicted. "Your stand against them that night was the beginning of their end." The sheriff shared how the arrest had led to the recovery of stolen items from various farms, including the Thompson family's precious heirlooms and the Miller's savings. The young man, the one who'd been the first to flee that night, had turned state's evidence, providing information about other crimes and hidden caches of stolen goods. Later that week, Mr. Cooper organized a harvest celebration at his farm, larger than usual this year. As families gathered to share food and gratitude, Mrs. Henderson noticed how the atmosphere had changed from previous years. There was a new sense of security, of community strength. The farmers' wives who had sought her advice had formed a network of support and vigilance, sharing information and watching out for each other's properties. The young girl who had asked about bravery now helped Mrs. Henderson with her baby, showing the same gentle confidence she had admired in the older woman. "My pa's teaching me to shoot now," she confided proudly. "He says it's important for everyone to know how to protect themselves and their family." Mrs. Henderson's husband had become an advocate for farm security in the region, working with other farmers to implement better protection measures. The practices she had learned from her father in Texas were being adapted and shared throughout the community, creating a network of well-prepared homesteads. As she sat in the warmth of the harvest celebration, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, Mrs. Henderson reflected on how a single night of courage had rippled out to affect so many lives. The skills her father had insisted she learn, the preparation she had maintained, and the calm she had found in crisis had not only protected her family but had helped strengthen an entire community. The sun began to set over the gathered families, casting long shadows across the farmyard. Children played between the hay bales, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze. Farmers discussed the harvest and their plans for winter, their conversations now interspersed with gratitude for their renewed sense of security. Mrs. Henderson watched as her husband demonstrated proper gun safety to a group of interested farmers, using the same patient teaching style her father had used with her. She smiled, knowing that her daughter would grow up in a community that valued strength, preparation, and mutual support, a community that had learned the true meaning of courage. The evening ended with Mr. Cooper raising a toast to their farming community's resilience and unity. As lanterns were lit and wagons prepared for the journey home, Mrs. Henderson felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The attempted robbery had tested her courage, but its true legacy was in how it had brought out the best in everyone around her. That night, as she rocked her daughter to sleep in the same kitchen where she had faced down danger, Mrs. Henderson whispered her father's wisdom to the next generation: "True courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being prepared, staying calm, and standing strong for what matters most."